Hi knitters, welcome to episode 5 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter and I'm a tech editor, and I promise I won't start every episode showing you my sweet little boy Moo for bribery, but I do have an ask this week, so I'm using him as bribery. So this podcast that I've started is obviously quite new. We're just on 5 episodes, but the point of this podcast is to help you, the knitter, get answers to questions that I see all the time to make your knitting journey a better one. So because I'm new, I would love to get a little bit of feedback from you about the episodes themselves. I would love to know if you think that they are the right length, whether my pace is right for sharing new information, whether they're too long or too short, and whether they're too math forward or not. Obviously, every week is not going to be talking about math quite in depth as we are with these modification episodes, but I would love to just know how I can improve if you think it needs improvement and how I can make it the most digestible for you. Okay, that's it for the asks for you this week. I'm going to jump right in to share what I know to help make your knitting journey better. Okay, so for those of you who have not watched last week's episode yet, today is a bit of continuation, and let's just review a little bit about the style of sweater that we're discussing in this week's video. We are talking about circular yoke style sweaters, which are very common for color work or textural work, or even just a plain stockinette stitch sweater. They can be worked top down or bottom up, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking about a top down example. We're going to be using a schematic and a mini pattern that I created for last week's video. So if you still have your copy, that's excellent. If you don't, there are links to download them in the description below the video. So unlike in episode 3, where we talked about modifying sleeve circumferences for a drop shoulder style sweater, which is more easily modified because you can just adapt the circumference by knitting your yoke deeper or shallower, less deep, shallower. When you're working a circular yoke style sweater, you have to be more careful about your stitch counts. So a circular yoke is worked very similar to a cone. So you have the number of stitches that you cast on at your neckline, and then you have multiple sort of rings of increase rounds that are worked down the depth of the yoke to reach an ultimate circumference at your underarms, where you'll separate the sleeves from the body. So any changes that you make to stitch counts sort of that differ from the pattern can have a pretty big impact on the final circumference of both the sleeves and the body. So today we're going to be talking about how to modify the sleeves without impacting the circumference of your body. And as you may have guessed, there's a lot of math. So just like in our previous tutorials, we're going to be referencing the sample schematic and mini pattern that I have linked below several times throughout the video. The schematic is representative of the mini pattern insofar as it is just 3 sizes. It's not a full pattern. So it's just to give you an idea of where we need to look to get the information to make the modifications we need to fit our body. So for the purposes of the example today, we're going to say that we're knitting a size 2 sweater for the body, which has a 40-inch finished circumference, but we want to adapt it to have size 3 sleeves. So we're going to be knitting them a little bit larger. Certainly there are people who need to adapt the opposite way. They need to have a smaller sleeve circumference for the body style that they're knitting. It's been my experience that this is less common, so we're going to speak about enlarging it today, or enlarging the sleeves today. But if you have questions about how to make it smaller, or if we have enough demand, I can certainly make an additional tutorial going in the future that talks about how to make the sleeves smaller. So when you're working a top-down sweater, whether it's a circular yoke like I'm discussing today, or a raglan style, when you separate the sleeve stitches from the body stitches, very often stitches are cast on at the underarm to sort of, create a horizontal space under your arm so you don't have just a point of stitches under your arm. But it also generally finishes the circumference of the body. So your body total stitch count is generally fewer than you need the total circumference to be to actually knit the body. I hope that makes sense. It'll get clearer as I go through what the steps are. But essentially, what I'm trying to drive at there is what I see the mistake made very commonly is people will say, well, I want to make the sleeves larger, so when I separate the sleeves from the body, I'm just going to cast on more stitches at the underarm so that the hole for the arm is larger. But the problem with that theory, and I get the theory, it makes sense, is that those stitches that you cast on will also make your body circumference larger. So we have to find the difference between making the sleeve sizes larger without impacting the body circumference, and it has almost nothing to do with the number of stitches you cast on at your underarm. So there's two options for modifying a yoke sleeve, a sleeve for your yoke, a sleeve for your sweater. There's two options. Okay, bear with me. The first option is what we're going to be discussing today. You're going to choose a size from within the pattern. So in this case, we're going to choose to increase our sleeves to a size 3. The second option, I'm not going to discuss too much in depth, but basically it's choosing your own sleeve size. So if you're knitting a size 2 and you want a 40-inch circumference, but you don't want a 12-inch circumference sleeve as the pattern suggests it would be for your size, but you don't want a 13.5-inch upper sleeve circumference, you can choose what size you want that sleeve to be, but it does take more math, and we're not going to go into that in today's method just because I want to sort of streamline our math. However, what I'm going to walk you through applies to that same concept. I would suggest that if that's what you want to do, go back and watch episode 3 where we talk about the second option for adjusting the circular or the upper arm circumference for your sleeve. It gives you the math on how to figure out how many stitches you need for your sleeve and also how to shape the sleeve so that you end up at the correct sleeve circumference, cuff circumference for your size. Go into that. I just want to address the fact that when I write my patterns for top-down style sweaters, whether it's raglan or circular, I aim to have the same number of stitches cast on for the underarm for every size. That is not always the case for other designers' work, and so I want to try and make this universal. I will go into what to do a little bit for the sleeves at the end of the example when I'm done referencing my pattern, so that if you're working from a pattern that has you cast on a different number of stitches for the underarm for size 2, which is 8 in the case of this pattern, versus maybe they have you cast on 10 stitches at the underarm for a size 3, I'll address that at the end of this the section where I'm discussing my pattern. Okay, so I haven't forgotten about you. I know that's an option. Okay, so when we are looking at adjusting the sleeves, we're going to be looking at the total number of stitches that are on the needles before we divide the sleeves from the body, which I suppose makes sense. But we have to make the adjustment before we work our as we work our final increase round. You want to be very careful that you're not changing the depth of the yoke for your size, as if you tried to knit even and work, say, a 6th increase round, you could impact the yoke depth in a way that you don't want to. So it's always best practice to maintain the depth of the yoke prescribed for your size, just to be sure that you don't end up with something way too long. And then you get into the territory of dolman, which is super cute, but may not be what you're going for. Okay, so the mini pattern that I've written has 5 increase rounds that are worked down the length of the yoke. So we're going to be looking at the difference in stitch counts between increase round number 4 and increase round number 5. Number 4 is obviously not detailed out. I've just provided you with a number that is the stitch count that we need if we had worked all 5 increase rounds or all 4 increase rounds. So we're just going to be focusing on the numbers from the end of yoke increase round number 4 and our target stitches for yoke increase round number 5. So Using our sample size of size 2, at the end of yoke increase round number 4, we should have 224 stitches on our needles. And if we look at the target number of stitches at the end of yoke increase round number 5, we've got 256 stitches. So we're increasing 32 stitches on yoke increase round number 5. So we're going to look ahead to the number of stitches that we use for the size 2 sleeve versus the size 3 sleeve when we're working the divide for sleeves section, so we can figure out how many stitches we actually need to add to divide to maintain the body size and achieve the larger sleeves. So from the 256 stitches that we are aiming for the end of yoke increase round number 5 for size 2, 46 stitches on each are going to be put on hold for each sleeve. So 46 plus 46 is 92, which means that from those 256, 164 are going to remain to make up the circumference of the body. And that's a really important number because we don't want to change the circumference of the body. So now that we know that we have to maintain 164 stitches, now we need to look at the number of stitches that need to be put on hold for size 3 when we divide the sleeves from the body. For size 3, it's 52 stitches. So if you remember, for size 2, it's 46 stitches. So we have 6 stitches more that we need to be able to place on hold for each sleeve, or 12 total. So knowing that we need to have 6 extra stitches per sleeve, or 12 total, we're going to add those 12 stitches to our target of 256, so that when we divide out those extra sleeve stitches, we still have 164 stitches on the needle to make up our body circumference. Instead of increasing by 32 stitches to get to 256, we have to increase by 44 stitches to get to 268. This will allow us to maintain the 164 stitches that we need for the body, but will give us the 52 stitches we need for each sleeve. So to figure out the math on this, and don't worry, I'm going to put all of this in the information below the video in the description, so you don't have to write it all down. But basically what we have to do is figure out now what the spacing of our increases needs to be, since it's now going to differ from what the pattern says. So to do that, we're going to use the same formula that we used in last week's video when we talked about modifying the collar circumference. We're going to take our total number of existing stitches, which is 224, and divide it by the total number of stitches that we need to increase, which is 44. So when I divide that out, it works out to be roughly 5.1. I'm rounding up. I think it was 5.09 something numbers. But since we can't knit 0.1 of a stitch, we have to round that number up to be 6 and down to be 5, so that we know we're going to be increasing in multiples of 5 or 6 across our round. And to figure out how many times we have to work an interval of 5 stitches versus 6 stitches, we need to do the math of 5x plus 6y equals 224, because that's the number of stitches we currently have on our needle. And x plus y has to equal 44, which is the total number of stitches that we're increasing. I've done the math for you. And we end up needing to work the 5-stitch interval 4 times and the 6-stitch interval 40 times, which is kind of nice symmetrically, isn't it? So now we know the ratio of spacing that we need to work across the round. And as I discussed in last week's video, you can choose to apply these 44 stitches increased however you would like. So if we say that the beginning of round is at the center back of your sweater, actually the sample does say that, so let's go with that. You can choose to work K5, make one left 2 times from the beginning of round, then work the K6, make one left 40 times until you get to the last 10 stitches. And then you can work the K5, make one left 2 times again. So basically your smaller interval of stitches will be mirrored over the beginning of round marker. Or if you want to simplify it, you can simply work the K5, make one left 4 times all in a row, and then you simply work the K6, make one left to the end of the round. Because we're not creating increases within a specific section of the garment, for example, like in a raglan style where you're working increases in the sleeve only or increases in the body only, you're distributing those stitches all the way across the round anyway, so it's not going to impact the shaping. It's really up to you how you want to apply that. Okay, so that was the hardest part of the math, okay? And if you need clarification about any of this, please leave a comment in the question, or a question in the comments below, and I'm happy to respond to you and clarify, because again, I know we go through that really quickly. So the last caveat, once you have figured out your spacing of your increases and you've worked your final increase round and your yoke is the depth you want it to be and it's time to divide the body and sleeves, yay! 2 things you're gonna have to do when you're now reading the instructions, right? So you are going to be following the instructions for any body stitches for size 2 and any sleeve stitches for size 3. So if we were to use the example pattern that we've got, you're going to knit the K41 just like it says at the very beginning of the instructions, because that is the half back body stitches, because remember our stitch markers at the center back of the sweater, and it's for the body, so you're not impacted by the sleeves yet. So you're going to knit 41 for the body, and then it says to place the next X number of stitches on waste yarn for the right sleeve. Because you're increasing your sleeve size, you need to put the larger number, which is 52 stitches, on hold, not 46. Okay, so now you've got your half back stitches are still on your working needle, your 52 stitches instead of 46 are on waste yarn, and now you're going to cast on your underarm stitches. So because my patterns always have the same number of stitches cast on at the underarm, you're just going to cast on the required 8 number of stitches. The 8 count of stitches? You're just going to cast on the required 8 stitches as per the pattern for any size that you're working. Now here's where the caveat comes in. If you are knitting a pattern where the total number of underarm stitches cast on is different from the size of body you're making versus the size of sleeve you're making. So if you are, we'll sort of use numbers from this pattern again. If you're knitting a size 2 body, you have to maintain the number of underarm stitches cast on for the body for the size you're making. So if you're making a size 2 sweater and you want the body to remain at size 2, you have to cast on the number of stitches at the underarm for the body that you want to make. Then when it comes time to make the sleeves, you're going to follow all instructions for size 3, including picking up and knitting the underarm stitches as per size 3. So if your body had you cast on 8 stitches at the underarm, but your sleeve needs you to pick up and knit 10 stitches at the underarm, that's okay. You have 8 to already pick up and knit from, but there's often a little gap between pardon me, the stitches that you cast on at the underarm and the live stitches that you placed on hold. So you can always pick up and knit those 2 additional stitches to go from 8 to 10 into that gap at the underarm. And actually this is a really wonderful way to close up any extra gaps that you might otherwise sew closed at the end of your sweater when you're weaving in the ends anyway. Okay, so how's your head? I know that's a lot of math, and I'm going to try and do my best to make sure that all of this is laid out in the description below the video, so that if any of it was a little too fast, you could look at the numbers again and digest it at your own pace. You know, as someone who does this almost every day for a living, I still have to sit back and think about how to apply all of these numbers. So if you don't get it right away, please don't beat yourself up about it, but please ask questions. I want to make sure that you walk away from this understanding everything, so that if you have to modify a sweater, that you feel like, I got this, I can do the math. So there's just a couple of things that I want you to consider when you're going to be modifying a pattern, specifically using this method. So for a top-down circular, is there a stitch pattern or color work motif in the sleeves or body that might get thrown off by these different stitch counts? More often than not, a yoked sweater's pattern stops when you separate the sleeves from the body, because it's truly meant to be kind of like a circular like necklace of decoration around the yoke. But just make sure that any additional stitches that you may add or subtract from your sleeves when you try to adjust them won't impact the color work, or if it does, that you feel comfortable making those modifications. I always recommend reading ahead and checking to make sure the numbers will still align before you jump in, because heaven forbid if you had to rip all that work back, especially if it's color work. And then the other one, and it's potentially a little less concerning depending on how much you're changing your sleeve circumference, is, do you have enough yarn? This is for the people in the back row. If you're going to be making modifications to make any portion of your garment larger than what the pattern specifies for that size, please make sure that you're going to have additional yardage. Okay, so here we are at the end of everything. We had a nice little, I don't know, I think of it as a treat. I had episodes 4 and 5 back to back, 1 week after another. Typically, I shoot these episodes every 2 weeks. So episode 6, where we're talking about raglan sleeve modifications, is going to be coming up in 2 weeks to get us back on our regular schedule. But did you know that every week that I'm not releasing a new episode of Knit Talk, I am releasing new technique-driven tutorials for your knitting. So I've started to call them Want to Learn Something Wednesdays, and it's just a really fun way for us to stay in touch in the intervening weeks when I don't have these long-form tutorials for you. So if you ever have ideas about tutorials that you want to see on those sort of intervening weeks, or if you've got discussion topics that you would like to see me cover in this long form on Knit Talk, please feel free to submit those through the discussion form that I have linked below in the description. And if you like to get emails, I would love for you to subscribe to my newsletter. I also have a link to that in the description below. You will get a notification every Wednesday when I've uploaded the new tutorials. And if I happen to release a new pattern, which is every so often, there is a special newsletter subscriber discount that's a little bit better than people get through my social media or through my blog. So that's a great way to stay in touch between episodes if you have questions or if you want to see different things talked about. Okay, I want to say thank you in advance for any feedback that you may offer about the formatting of these episodes. It really is kind of a winging it and see how I do when each episode, I mean, not the discussion topics, those are planned out, but getting the format right so that it's the most digestible, the most enjoyable for you as someone who's trying to learn. I would love to know what you think. Thank you so much again for being here. I really enjoy any comments that you leave and hearing about your successes or even your challenges. And have a great week. Happy knitting.